Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfoud, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to Medieval Church History. I'm Teresa Holman, and with me is Father Michael Witt. Welcome, Father.
Thank you, Teresa.
It is so good to be in medieval church history, I guess, and to be past the Crusades for right now. And the title of today's show, Prosperity Comes to Europe, Cities, Fairs, and Juice, looks good.
It is good.
Sounds good.
It is good, yeah.
Sounds like we're getting into some lighter times, maybe.
Oh, I'll tell you, this is the medieval Renaissance. This is the glorious, splendid 13th century. As I said last time around, it really only lasted 25 years, but let's enjoy it.
But those 25 years were powerful.
They were, and the afterglow is still very much with us. You know,
amazing, even today.
Yeah, this summer I had an opportunity to spend a little time in France, and when I was taking a train out to Lisieux, I met an architect from India, interestingly enough, and he had his office in Normandy, but lived in Paris. He commuted back and forth, and we got talking about some of the just incredible architecture we had been visiting, and the Notre Dame, of course, and Sainte-Chapelle, and some of the other just wonderful, glorious sites. And he said, you know, we can't build these things anymore. We cannot build these things anymore. Now think about that. Think about here in the United States, even the Episcopal National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., it took decades and decades to build, 80 years, something like that. And the craftsmanship was so hard to come by. And here you have, just Europe is dotted with these incredible cathedrals, monasteries, wonderful places that came about in this particular time. We just, now that those are stones, go back to the just the incredible importance of Thomas Aquinas as he pulls together. He didn't invent medieval theology, but he codified it, in the Summa, and we'll be looking at that also. What an incredible document that was. There's so many other things that this is an age of just an explosion of new life, and then the afterglow of that life continues to impact us today if we're willing to be impacted by it, and we refuse it at our own peril.
Yes, definitely.
So this is kind of exciting stuff.
This is very exciting.
Yeah. Well, we're going to be looking at cities. Cities and Christianity are tied together right from the very beginning. It's good for us to reflect on that a little bit. We did earlier on as we began the course. But when we think about the apostolic evangelization that takes place at the very beginning, where do the apostles go? They go to cities. And we have, again, an afterglow of that. We have the leftovers, the remains of that, of Paul's missions to Corinth, major city there, 2 letters to the Corinthians. And then, of course, St. Clement's letter also later on. Ephesus, Thessalonica, Rome itself, all these major cities, and these are the ones that are that come to our mind immediately because they're in the New Testament with us. At the same time, there were others that didn't make it into the New Testament, but they certainly found evangelization very early on. Like, for instance, in southern France at Massilia, the present city of Marseille, and then going into France in Lyon, of course, Irenaeus of Lyon, Tours, Martin of Tours, Paris, Saint-Denis, and the martyrs of the Montmartre. So you have, and that's just a smattering. So wherever there were cities, the church went. And right from the very beginning, there's that close tie-in. And, of course, just as the cities suffered through the Dark Ages, so did the church. And when we had that triple onslaught of the Muslims, of the Norsemen, and of the Magyars, you had naturally then a decline of these cities, many of them being sacked and ruined, and then, of course, a long period of a decline of commerce. in which people just did not travel very much. It was just too difficult, too dangerous. Up in the north, the Scandinavians, the Norsemen dominated. We remember those Vikings. Remember, those were tough times. And then at the same time that's going on down in the south and in the Mediterranean, you've got Muslim pirates and raiders. We've seen that, how Italy was constantly being ravaged, Spain ravaged, southern France ravaged, the islands ravaged. And in most of the cities that go back to Roman times were simply too large to enclose and to defend. There are a few exceptions to that. Constantinople is the best exception. Those were incredible walls, and they were only breached, unfortunately, as we've seen in the Fourth Crusade. In Rome, remember, after several attacks, Pope Leo finally puts his foot down, and then he cordoned off part of Rome. Couldn't defend the entire city of Rome, but he built a great wall around part of Rome. Remember, that's the Leonine Rome,
Wall.
the Leonine Wall. In some cases, the best the cities could do was to establish castles so that people could go and flee into the castles when they were attacked. Paris had castles. The most famous is the Bastille, which of course has been taken down now. The Louvre also originally was a castle. And then eventually they did build a wall around part of the city, much of the city. Other smaller cities actually grew out of Roman camps, and so there were some defensive earthworks to begin with. An interesting part, the term for camp, a military camp in Latin is a castra. Did you know the castra?
No.
And in English it comes out to us as Chester. So cities like in England, that end in Chester, like for instance Westchester, Winchester, Manchester, those are all named after castra or castre, after Roman camps. They started out that way. Then what happens is that over the centuries we saw that eventually the raiders waned. In the case of the Norsemen, they settled down and kind of joined in with everybody, or in the case of Sicily and southern Italy, they took over and kind of ruled it. But they had a stake. That's the important part. They had a stake in the affairs. The Magyars the same way. Eventually, most of them settling into what is present-day Hungary. The Muslims eventually are going to wane after the Caliph Omar. There are fewer and fewer incursions, organized incursions into the West. And so with this waning of all of these raiders, and then also add to that the stimulus of the Crusades, because it caused people to begin to travel again, and that caused tastes to blossom, then trade comes along, and so the commerce. And so throughout the one of the side effects of the Crusades is to cause commerce to begin happening all over again. And we've seen that the hub of all of this, whether we like them or not, is Venice. The Venetians were right in the middle. They were transporting, selling, buying, selling, warehousing, grain, wine, lumber, a lot of this coming out of Europe and making its way to Constantinople. Constantinople, you're trading for silk and gold, and we'll see other things also. Now, add into that some of the other maritime cities, like, for instance, Genoa and Pisa. And we see them getting involved, and there's nothing like competition.
Right.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of competition going on with that. And then by the time you get to the Norman conquest of Spain and southern Italy, and then after Venice and the Fourth Crusade, and remember what happens there is that the papacy then shifts away from Venice and begins giving more business to the other crusaders, more business to the other cities. That increases even more. That increases the trade and the competition. Add to that the tie-in between the Amalfi traders, and Amalfi commerce and the Holy Land. Remember that the Hospitallers were founded originally as a hostelry for pilgrims, and so there's that tie-in. Which goes on, and it's not just pilgrims. Remember, then, as time goes on, the Hospitallers begin to realize that this becomes a trade possibility too. So that's an increase in commerce. You've got the Latin kingdoms in the east. Remember those 4 kingdoms in the east? Mm-hmm. They're never able to stand on their own, so they're always in need of supplies. And so they're always calling upon the shipping concerns of Genoa, of Pisa, of Amalfi, And so what we have then over a period of time is the development of a trading system. You can almost call it a trade nexus that's happening and between the East and the West, including the Far East. And so the center of this really is the city of Baghdad. And how this happens is that you have all kinds of trade that make their way by caravan to Baghdad, and then in shipping, and it's coming up basically through the Persian Gulf, and then from there, caravans then begin taking these goods off to Damascus in Syria. And Damascus is an important trading center there, to other parts of Syria, like, for instance, the city of Antioch and Laodicea, which is presently the city of Latakia on the Mediterranean coast. It's not known for much. Most people don't know that city, but pipe smokers know it.
Oh, okay.
There's a particular tobacco that comes from that area called Latakia or Latakia, and if you smoke a pipe and you've ever had it, you'll never forget it. It's not going to say that you'll necessarily like it, but you'll never forget it. And then another city also, of course, of Tripoli. And so these are major ways then of transporting these goods to the east, or transporting the western goods to the east, and the other way around. Also in Palestine, you'll have caravans that'll be taking goods from Baghdad to Acre, for instance.
Oh, okay.
Remember the Christian city there, and also Joppa. And then, of course, Jerusalem is just an incredibly important city in all of this trade, too. Now, keep in mind that these are Christian traders who are trading with Muslim traders. There are Jewish traders all involved in this. Again, I hope this kind of breaks down some of the black and white impressions that we have of this clash of civilizations.
Right.
The reality is that people were working with each other quite well, during most of this time, and everyone prospered as a result. Well, we'll say a little bit later on some things about how it was not easy to be a minority in these countries. It was not easy to be a Jew living in Europe. It was not easy to be a Jew or a Christian living in Muslim countries either. I'll say something about that a little bit later on. But as all of these goods then make their way to the Levant, to the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, then they're taken by ship from these port cities, and they're sent to Cyprus, especially the port city of Famagusta, or they're sent to Crete. Again, another city, Candia. They're sent to Sicily, another important city there, Messina. And then from Messina, they're going to be sent off to Amalfi and Naples and Pisa, Genoa, or they're going to make their way into France in Marseille. And then others are going to be landed in Palermo, and from there they'll be taken and turned around and then sent off to Barcelona. So all of this, I've used this term before of a culinary crescent.
Oh, right.
Do you remember? And that culinary crescent runs from around Barcelona in Spain, and then all the way through the northern Mediterranean, through Provence and around into northern Italy, and then all the way down to Rome and even Naples.
Right.
And this crescent then is really being fed, by wonderful spices, and of course the herbs are already there, but the spices and the different foods and cloths and everything else that makes for a heightened culture.
I think we talked about that being a wonderful tour.
Yes, we did. Yeah. In the north, things are not necessarily sitting around either. There's progress happening up in the north, and particularly in wool industry, in the wool development.
Oh.
And there you have, and especially in Flanders, that's that lowlands, those flat lands between France and into Belgium, okay, and that Flemish wool industry is absolutely famous. People are putting themselves together there. There you have everything coming together. You've got everything coming together in an integrated kind of a way. You've got sheep all over the place. And not only do you have sheep in the Flemish area itself, but also within easy transport. England is growing lots of sheep. Easy to get that wool over to the Flanders, parts of France, Germany. So there's a lot of sheep going on there. Then you have a whole trade of what's called carters. In fact, someone whose last name is Carter is a English descendant of these guys.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Isn't that interesting? It's a block of wood with nails in it. Okay, just a block of wood with a bunch of nails in it, and then what you do is you take all of this wool that you're getting, and then you run the what's called a card. You run this cart through. You rake it, and so that gets the fibers all separated. Yeah, those are carters, and they're doing that. And then there are other people who are bleachers. So what they do is they just take and they bleach all of this wool fibers, and then other people are going to take this bleached fiberized wool, and they're then going to turn around and turn it into yarn or into thread. These people are called weavers, all right?
Okay.
And then
Goodness.
the weavers are then going to give their wares over to another group called spinners, and they're going to spin it and actually make the thread and the yarn itself. And then other people are going to take that and the spinners and then the weavers. Okay, and the weavers are going to weave the wool together into cloth, and then others are going to take that cloth and then turn it into actual garments. And these, of course, are tailors. And we've got a lot of people with last names as a result of this, huh?
We do, don't we?
Carters.
Trying to figure out what the bleachers were, but got weavers.
Yeah, White, maybe.
Tailors. Maybe the Whites.
The Whites, yeah. Yeah, Mr. and Mrs. White. I don't know. I'm guessing. But certainly tailors.
Blanco. I don't know.
Yeah, Blanco. Yeah, who knows? The best in all of Europe will be the Flemish. They are just good at everything. And in their towns, they have an integration of these industries. And so they have what's known in economics as a comparative advantage. So they have an advantage over most of the others. The English might have their sheep, okay, but they don't have the weavers and the weaving machinery. Like now, later on, of course, in the Industrial Revolution, you're going to have all that'll change.
Sure.
But when you're looking at the medieval Industrial Revolution, the Flemish have the comparative advantage so much that it is, believe it or not, it is cheaper for them, for someone in the industry to import one of these Flemish cloth merchants to import raw wool from the wool producing areas from England, bring the wool over, have it processed, and then export it back to England, and it's actually cheaper to get that cloth that way than it is for the English to do it themselves. I remember some years back taking a course on international economics, and this whole concept of comparative advantage came up. And I'll remember very well, Dr. Plummer, the professor who was teaching the course, said, you know, in Iceland, if they wanted to, they could grow their own bananas. And, you know, when you look at the hothouses and all this kind of stuff, well, they could. And he said, but they wouldn't be the best bananas in the world. And besides, it would cost a lot more than it would for them just to send down to Central America and buy
down and pick them up.
That's right. And so Honduras or Nicaragua has a comparative advantage over Iceland.
Okay.
You know, by the same token, someone from Honduras who might have a strange attraction to eating cod could do that, but it's a lot cheaper to buy it from the Icelanders. You know, so that's the comparative advantage, and that's what the Flemish had. And you have a sorting out in the Middle Ages of a sense of this, so that some people simply stopped trying to produce everything on their own because they could get it cheaper at Walmart.
Right.
You know?
Exactly. Okay.
Well, but in order to do that, you've got to have peace. And Europe was at peace throughout this. There was a modicum of peace and stability. Interestingly enough, I just said something about peace, but, you know, in 1066, the Normans invaded England. While they were running around invading other countries too, they invaded England. And when they got over to England, think about this, we tend to think of the Normans, you know, William the Conqueror and all that as being English. But remember, they're all speaking French. They think of themselves as French. And when they got over and they conquered the English, the first thing they did was they said, boy, that was a thirsty battle, that Battle of Hastings. What do you have to drink? And the English go, well, beer. You know, we're Anglo-Saxons, we're Germans. You know, and they go, beer? No way. And so they brought with them their taste for wine. And so there is now another trade that's being built up between England and across the English Channel, in particularly in Bordeaux, on the Garonne River, and the Loire River. Okay, and the wines that are being produced along those areas there now become very attractive to the English, and so they look for ways in order to import. And so the wine industry gets a real kick, really, because of the Norman conquest of England, strangely enough. There are two ways of doing this this commerce. It's much cheaper to do it by water than it is by land. That's the tough way to do it, but there are two basic ways to do that, and one is by sea. Taking the Mediterranean, going through the Mediterranean, that's a pretty nice little trip. I mean, you know, nowadays people vacation in cruise ships, you know. But then what happens is when you get out to the Atlantic, nobody takes a cruise ship in the Atlantic. You know? If you've ever crossed the English Channel in one of those ferries, even with all the modern adjusting mechanisms, it's still a rough trip, and a lot of commerce was destroyed. So that's the dangerous way. They're looking for another safer way to do it by water, and they discovered the incredible French rivers as a result. And so that's why it becomes so important. If you're going to have commerce with Northern Europe, with England, with Scandinavia, the best way to do that is to land your goods at like Marseille, okay? And then it's on the Rhone River. You go up the Rhone River, and right up, you're going straight north into central France, and you get to Lyon. And at the city of Lyon, the Rhone makes a right turn and heads into the Alps, and it becomes a narrow river, and there's not as many people living there. So what you do instead is you go a little bit further, and you get to the city of Saône, and you're following rivers again, and you move into a region known as the Côte d'Or. If you look at your French map, find the city of Dijon. Okay. And famous, of course, for its mustard. But when you reach there, then you get onto the Marne River, which is a lovely little river, and you go down that river. Down is important because that means you don't have to have horses pull you. right? You just kind of float on down, and you float down to the city of Champagne, or the region of Champagne, rather, the city of Rheims. And then it continues, the Marne continues on. And as a result, these cities in that central area become the spot where traders go in order to buy and sell goods. And to do this, and to make this happen, these cities, they're relatively small cities, they begin setting up fair committees. And those fair committees pull off these commercial fairs every year. And, for instance, some of the earlier ones are at Troyes. It's, I guess 75 miles east of Paris or so. Provins, Lannay-sur-Marne, and then, of course, these are all some of the Champagne fairs. And in each of these towns, in these little cities, there are going to be booths that are going to be set up, and they're temporaries. Okay, they'll be there for a couple of days. You ever go to a county fair, a state
I was just
fair?
thinking of this summer, every year summer county fair.
Yeah. Yeah. Another one that I'm very familiar with, of course, south of St. Louis, is the Jour de Fête in St. Genevieve. And there you have a town of about 4,500 people that all of a sudden just doubles in size. And you've got all of these booths, some of them little, some of them large, all over that town. Every square foot is of premium. And so the townspeople sort of step back a little bit. I know some of them leave town for a while, but they step back a little bit. But it's good for commerce because they don't close their shops. Their shops are right there with everybody else. So people come in to buy and sell, lots of trading, lots of commerce, and they stay. The people that live there stay. Now, here's an interesting invention, too, that a lot of people don't know about. Bay windows. If you were to take one of these little towns, okay, and you've got yourself, let's say, a 2-story building, but they're attached one to another, and the family lives on the second floor, the first floor is used for the store. And a bay window is simply a window that opens out onto the street, and that actually becomes a sort of a shop window, a selling window.
Like your drive-up window. It's your walk-up.
Yes, it's your walk-up window. Yeah, and so you kind of show your fares there, or you sell your fares through that, and so all of this is going on. There's a lot of excitement, a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of police also. These towns are very, very careful to police themselves.
That's important.
And then right in the center of the whole thing, there's a booth that is set up specifically for the money matters. And that's where the accounts are kept, because there's not always one of the things they realized was that it's difficult to carry around a lot of cash, especially since we're talking about any kind of currency. Dukes are making their own currency. Sometimes they're pounds, they're livres, there are thalers, batsons, you name it. There are all kinds of pesos, all kinds of things. And so there is no stability in the currency itself. And so what people are going to be doing in these fairs is they're going to be using commercial paper. So they'll be writing notes, promissory notes to each other. And then those promissory notes are taken to the central booth. And then at the very end, there's a reckoning that happens. And so in the very end, you find out whether you've made money or lost money on that fair, whether you ended up with more goods than what you had intended to buy, or maybe not as many, whether you're cash rich or not. And in the middle of all of this is the center of all of this is going to be the fine art of arbitrage, and that's where you're going to determine what is a batzen worth up against a Joachimsthaler, and somebody has to make that decision, and and we still do arbitrage today, of course, and that's the determining factor about what everything really costs. That's why if you go to Europe, this past year, it's very expensive. I've often said, that sometimes, at least in the 80s, my experience was that if one year I could go to Germany and it was like walking into Neiman Marcus, and the next year I could go simply because of the exchange rate, and I'm walking into Walmart.
Right.
It's the same goods, it's the same meals, it's the same services, but it's all because of the exchange rate, and that's what these guys are doing is overseeing that. It's an emporium of everything. Coming out of the north, you're going to have furs, honey, timber, and there'll be contracts for timber, not just the timber itself, but contracts for timber. From England, there's going to be tin, huge tin mines over there, so lots of tin will be coming over. As I said before, wool. Out of Italy, you're going to have fine swords and cutlery, sturdy war horses. Coming out of the other Italian cities, having traded over in the east and the far east, you'll have spices, sugar, silks, and then out of Flanders itself, you'll have wool. Here's an interesting example of this comparative advantage that we talked about. There was also there were fairs that were not just, of course, in Champagne, but also in other areas. And one of the famous fairs in England is an area known as Boston. Our Boston here in the United States is named after that city of Boston. But in eastern England, there is this Boston Fair. It was a wool area. But one of the interesting things developed there was that it was that the Flemish were coming over to the Boston Fair. They were buying the raw wool, okay, and they were buying it with money that they had gotten from the English in Boston, that they had gotten as a result of the sale of Italian goods and Italian imports.
Okay.
So that they had purchased in Champagne. So get a sense of this. Could you imagine now somebody from Flanders, okay, and he's over in England and he's buying wool from these people and he's paying them with their own money that they had given him in order to buy pepper that he had bought in Champagne, which some Italian from Genoa had brought in to Champagne, that he had brought from Damascus, that had originally before that had been on a caravan in Baghdad, which had been brought in from the Persian Gulf all the way down into the Indonesia.
It's tremendous to think in what a short time that this really happened.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is the Middle Ages.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting kind of stuff.
That's very exciting.
Then what happens is that every year there is this big financial conference or confab that happens up in northern Italy, when all of the fair representatives, the banking concerns, financial concerns of all these various fairs, they all meet in northern Italy, and during that meeting, they set the arbitrage rates for the whole year. It's
Boy, it sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's like the World Trade Organization,
Right.
These, interestingly enough, as big and as powerful as these people are, they were nothing in comparison to the workings of the Templars and the Hospitallers. So the entire secular financial world itself was still smaller than either one of these two orders.
Wow.
Yeah. And of course, everyone felt that their treasures were safer with those guys.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Somehow I could see that.
Yes. Now, because there's so many expenses involved and all, the role of these money lenders is very important. And often it's the kings that are going to be renting the money and large amounts of it. And all of this then will be based, their borrowing of this money is secured by their own lands or their own benefices that they had originally. And then what happens is that when they borrow money from the Templars or from the Hospitallers or from one of these smaller financial concerns, but we'll see a little bit later on, even those really tend to be families. When they borrow that interest, the first thing they do is they subtract what's called the expenses up front, and that is actually interest. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, that should catch us. Wait a minute, interest. Christians lending money to Christians and getting interest? Because we hear all the time, it's one of the urban legends that the church had rules against money lending, against usury. And that's sort of true. Mm-hmm. But as we're going to see, there is an understanding within all of this. The definition itself is different from our definition today. 10% is normally taken out, which was some 2% below what was allowed by Christian money lenders, particularly, let's say, for instance, in Aragon. So we're looking at about a 10% rate. Now, typically, Christians were allowed to charge up to 12% interest, and Jews tended to charge double that, 20 to 25% interest rate.
Wow.
And I'll explain why in a couple minutes. But there's a lot of misunderstanding about this because we look back at this thing about charging interest as being considered sinful or anti-Christian. Remember the phrase from Scripture, give and expect nothing in return. You know, the reality is that everyone understood that there were repayments that included not only the repayment itself, the principal, but also a repayment of what was considered to be a risk factor. And so that should be built into the repayment, and then also the opportunity costs. And so this is the understanding. This is, and I'm going to actually cite something from St. Thomas Aquinas a little bit later on that talks about this. But the idea is basically this: if you could invest in a project, and this was common Christian theology at the time concerning money lending. Okay. If you, as a money holder, could invest in a project that you could expect an 8% return in that year, okay, or you could lend it to the king, maybe a king with shaky finances, okay, you could lend that king that money at the 8%, but also along with that, consider, and the 8% is the opportunity cost, and then also consider the risk factor, and you negotiate that out at, let's say, 2%, so now you've come up with a 10%. So this king wants to borrow from you 1,000 pounds of silver, okay, and what you'll give him then is, or 10,000 pounds of silver, and what you'll give him then is 9,000 pounds of silver. He'll pay you back 10,000 pounds of silver. So that's that upfront cost. That's that 10%. It's not usury, as we understand it. That's a misuse of that term.
Right, certainly.
Yeah, and so then the whole thing is secured under, let's say, maybe a royal hunting lodge. Okay. So that if he fails to pay you that back in by a certain amount of time, then you become the owner of his hunting lodge. Well, whatever. The
difference kind of be a legitimate rate rather than a rate that was excessive.
Yeah, we're going to see where the laws of usury among in canon legal terms is really ungouging, and that's really where the church takes a very strong stand. But the very idea of some kind of a simple return on money is not. And 10%, I think, is, even today, that's a pretty hefty return on money.
Right.
I'd be happy.
You're right. Right now we happen to be at a time when that rate sounds pretty high, but
Yes.
it wasn't too long ago that people were coming out with rates that were much closer to what the Jews were charging at the time.
Right. Yes, that's right.
So.
And I think it would be good for us then to turn to Jewish commerce and see why they were charging so much more and all. It's really the Jewish communities in Europe that are the real oil of commerce across Europe. All of this stuff that we've been talking about, all of this trade, this shipment, this bailment of goods and warehouses and all that could never take place if it wasn't for the Jewish community in Europe. And this was happening even before the diaspora of 70 AD, and then there are a series of other diasporas that take place afterwards. But even we can see this in Roman times. The relationship between Jewish communities in Western Europe, I'm not talking necessarily just in Palestine, but all throughout Western Europe, and various lords. And this is all very, very true in the Middle Ages. You see, this is the important thing, is we remember feudalism. Remember how feudalism was set up, and it was all based upon that relationship between a lord and a vassal. Jews could not be vassals. And the reason they couldn't be is because they could not swear an oath to Christ. We tend to look at anti-Semitism in a 19th century, 20th century sense of a form of racism. Instead, what this is a religious glitch on the part of a population within Europe that could not take the necessary oath simply because of their own religious beliefs. Mm-hmm. And so they're unable to swear oaths. And as a result, then, the Jewish populations of Europe got locked out of the feudal system, which in some ways is not a bad thing. But also, they got locked out of Christian schools, and that's including medieval universities. So there's going to be an alternative universe, educational universe, that's going to be established among Jewish communities. And then also they got locked out of guilds, because these guilds themselves were religious as well as commercial and artisan kind of things. See that too. So over time, what happens is that the Jewish populations will shift to cities, large towns. Mm-hmm. They're going to live together, as in fact much of the guilds did in their own neighborhoods. These will be known as ghettos. And as I say, the guilds also. Some years ago, back in the 80s, I did some research on one particular very interesting guild in Germany, executioners. And executioners, this was a guild, it was a trade, and they lived in their own little communities. They intermarried, and to keep from marrying first cousins and all, executioners all throughout Germany knew each other, and they would make arrangements for marriage in between these families. And what went for executioners also went for cobblers and weavers and you name it, goldsmiths, whatever. There were a few trades in particular that the Jewish communities had their own almost a monopoly on, not quite a monopoly, but almost a monopoly. One was in the area of tailoring. Just excellent tailors, and passed down from generation to generation. And then also this money lending idea that we were just talking about. Usually, and this is an important factor, and this is why you have the higher rates, Jews had to register their loans with the local authorities. There was a reason for that, too. And that was because if you were a Christian and borrowed money from a Christian, part of that borrowing was an oath, a promise, a vow that you would pay that back. And under your vow to Christ, you would pay that back.
Responsible. Mm-hmm.
You would not make a vow or a promise to a Jew under Christ, and so therefore many borrowers did not have the same sense of ethics. And so what you needed then, if you're going to be a money lender, you needed to have some local clout from the Lord, who's going to make sure that those loans were repaid. And so he's got the muscle, or she, in some cases, queens and duchesses and all, they've got the muscle to make sure the payment gets paid. Now, where's their incentive? Well, their incentive is an upfront 10%. So here's the situation. If you go and take a loan from a Christian merchant or a money lender, and he charges you 10%, okay, and then you promise under a vow to heavens that you'll pay that back, fine, that's the 10%. If, on the other hand, maybe you're not able to borrow money from Christian lenders, there are reasons for that, and so you have to then go and go to a Jewish money lender. You're going to pay 20% for that. But that 20%, 10% right away goes over to the nobleman who's going to be enforcing that loan.
Takes that out.
Mm-hmm. And that's why you have what you have. I'd like to take a little reading from a very big book.
A large book.
And we were looking at this earlier. It's edited by David Bial, and it came out in 2002. The title is Cultures of the Jews, and it really is a very insightful study of ancient, medieval, and even modern Jewish cultures and the variety of them. And the book is about almost 1,200 pages long, weighs about 12 pounds, I figure. But in one of the paragraphs, one of the historians, Ivan Marcus, says the following, which I think is very fascinating about this whole interest rate situation, because it really militates against the Jewish community. So here's the Jewish community charging double rates and being hurt by the rates. Listen to this. Jewish money lending at immoderate interest or usury became a major factor in the impoverishment of Jewish communities in England and France in the 13th century. Although papal policy condoned Jewish lending at moderate rates of interest, canon lawyers and theologians opposed it absolutely. Now, I have to disagree with him a little bit, especially as we get into the last part of the 13th century. We're going to see this enshrined in the Summa Theologica. So I think he might be playing a bit with the urban legend here, but let's follow what he says. And in the late 13th century, the English and French kings implemented policies based on the stricter interpretation. In reality, this policy to eliminate Jewish money lending met with limited success because credit was always needed at all levels of society, especially consumer credit, which Jews provided. The measures taken against usury were usually economically and politically motivated, but other factors were also involved, such as asserting royal prestige or Christian piety, and in each case must be treated individually. So you have a situation in which they find themselves kind of betwixt and between in this, where the Jewish community could not lend at 10% because it took 10%, the Lords took the 10% right up front. There is going to be, and I think this is an important thing to keep in mind too, that anti-Semitism in Europe was by and large, the anti-Semitism of the Crusades was by and large very unpopular. If you remember, Bernard of Clairvaux was invited to come to the Rhineland to preach against anti-Semitism. The reason, and again, this stands against the urban legend, but we find many times, I was shocked when I was doing my readings into the Avignon papacy, the number of times that Avignon popes sent out proclamations to defend the Jews of Europe, and particularly those in the Avignon region themselves, and to protect their money lending status. again, it was the Archbishop of Mainz who had invited Bernard of Clairvaux to come over to preach against anti-Semitism, and the reason, and then certainly the emperors, the kings, the noblemen, and it wasn't because they were nice guys, it was because they yeah, I mean, they were getting their 10% up front and not doing anything for it.
Right.
What? It was the rabble really who were the anti-Semites of the time. Well, I mentioned something about guilds, and I'd like to say a little bit about that, a little bit about some of the towns and the relationship between the two. As I said before, you've got spinners, weavers, there's another group called fullers, carders, dyers, and they're all banding together in their own towns and industries. You also have other groups like carpenters, coopers, masons, merchants, and all. And what they do is, in any particular town, rather than compete with each other, what they're going to do is they're going to try to find ways in order to create a happy little situation, And how they do this is, first of all, they get together. That's the important. They get together, and the first time they get together, it's usually as a drinking club,
Right.
And they talk out their differences and all. They discuss business. And as they begin discussing business, they start talking about prices, setting prices. No, you don't charge too much now here. No, we won't charge too much. And, okay, we'll just, but I don't want you undercutting me either, And then they gather together and they use their influence as taxpayers and as citizens in these towns and cities to lobby city governments. And what they do then is they set up strict regulations, so that, let's say, a coopersmith, a man who's making barrels, moves into your town, Rothenburg on Tauber, moves into town, and he wants to set up a shop. Well, in order to do that, he's got to go to the town and get a license to set up a cooper shop, But to do that, to get that license, he has to pass an equivalency test, which is none other than given by the guild. Well, guess what? They're not going to let him in. Or if they do let him in, he's probably somebody's relative. So this guild system is very, very tight. They train their own new members, so they're going to be brought in as apprentices when they're young boys, and then they'll become journeymen, which literally means that they travel around, and then they'll become masters. And for the most part, these are members' sons. They are also religious fraternities. That's another reason why the Jews will have to have their own guilds rather than join in these guilds, because these guilds, they're going to include an annual fee to belong to this guild. That money will be used in order to keep up shrines for whoever saint is the patron of that town or the patron of that particular guild. They're going to pay for the burials for their members. Masses will be said for the deceased, and all of this is part. It's a religious fraternity as well as a trade guild. And then, as I said before, you'll have the intermarriage within these guilds. And like with the executioners that I've looked at, many of them living on the same streets or in the same districts. The word could be used for ghetto for them just as easily as the Jews. But this is also going to discourage competition, innovation, and technology.
Right.
The towns themselves are going to grow by leaps and bounds during this century. People are going to want to move to these towns. This is a new class of people are going to come about, named after the towns themselves. It's a bourg, or in the French, the term bourgeois. And nowadays we use that term in a derogatory manner, but it simply meant the middle class people living in the towns themselves. And quite honestly, in most cases, they were wealthier than the lords that they did business with. There's an old saying that city air sets one free. If you were a serf, remember how that whole class of people fell into serfdom. By the time we're talking about now, the 1200s, there are very few serfs around anymore, except in Eastern Europe. By and large, most of the serf class had succeeded in getting themselves out from underneath that. They were peasants, but they no longer had that servitude that they had before. But if you were in a serfish kind of dependence upon your lord, and if you could escape to a city and live and work there for 1 full year, you could get citizenship, and then you would have freedom.
There's the free air. Okay.
Yeah. These towns had self-representation. The citizens elected their representative bodies. These bodies often found themselves negotiating with and sometimes negotiating against the local lord. But remember, and here's where the church gets involved also, much of the time these local lords were themselves the bishops. Go back to the early part of our story, and we found that the bishops were these wonderful, great, honorable men who held Europe together as it disintegrated. But feudalism ruined bishops like it ruined everything else in the church, and the bishops became the toadies and the sons and the elderly uncles of the lords, and so feudalism brought them into conflict with the townspeople themselves, so that when you're coming out of feudalism and coming into this period that we're talking about now in the 1200s, these towns don't want the bishops to tell them what to do as far as the secular realm goes, because these bishops act more as family members of the local lord rather than for the people themselves or as shepherds of the church. And so in some cases you have townspeople forming into communes. Now think back, Teresa, when we were talking about northern Italy and Tuscany and the problems that were happening up in Milan, and remember that there was a group called the Patronini, right? And remember that that the Patronini were against much of the clergy and against the Bishop of Milan, and they were siding with Pope Gregory VII. And the issue was over clerical celibacy and over concubinage and simony. And so they were really reformers. This happens in several parts of Europe also, where when you have the running up against town communes, against lay lords, but also against bishops who are acting like lay lords. And we'll see this in northern Italy and parts of France in particular. Now, that's not to say that the church is bowing out, because the church is bigger than the bishops. And keep in mind, too, that many of these bishops are thinking in terms of the church and moving in that direction. The great cathedrals, which I hope we'll have a chance to talk about later on, they all were built, most of them were built within about a 30-year period of each other. And it's the bishops who are the real shakers and movers there. They're the ones that are going to insist on putting clocks in the towers so that everybody knows what time it is. All the great universities, it's going to be bishops that are going to be pulling these things together, and we'll be seeing some of that also, especially as we look at the development of the universities. When we come back next time around, I just want to say a couple things about a shift in the theology of money, and as people are looking at the sociology of change within Europe during this period of this medieval Renaissance and this medieval Industrial Revolution, because it's going to help us to understand the coming of yet another one of the great orders of the Church, that being the Cistercians.
Okay. All right. Wonderful show, Father. This was very interesting.
Yeah, it's good to talk about good things.
All this prosperity.
Yeah.
Yes, it is fun to talk about the good times.
Yeah.
Shall we close with a prayer?
Okay. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
May Almighty God bless you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, Father.
Okay.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.